Have you ever stopped to think that maybe the big historical stories we all sort of accept might just be, well, smoke and mirrors, maybe hiding something much bigger, much darker?
It's a provocative thought.
It really is. And today, we're digging into something truly wild. A 1978 investigative book called Dope, Inc., Britain's Opium War against the U.S.
Ah, yes, Dope, Inc. That one's definitely caused some ripples.
You could say that. I mean, this isn't your standard history book. It's
Right.
an expose, yeah. Put together by a huge, 100-person research team led by Lyndon LaRouche.
Right, LaRouche, a controversial figure in himself, which adds another layer.
Absolutely. And the central claim is just, well, it's mind-bending. The book basically says the global drug trade, especially narcotics flooding the U.S., isn't just, random criminal gangs doing their thing.
No, they go much further than that.
Oh, way further. The authors of Dope, Inc. allege it's a deliberate, planned-out form of political warfare, a secret campaign run by the British monarchy and their associated oligarchy against the United States.
It's an enormous accusation, a staggering one, really.
It is. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really carefully unpack this complex web of connections and, well, accusations that the book lays out. We want to help you listening understand the arguments and the evidence, quote unquote, as the authors present it.
Yeah, it's crucial to emphasize that as presented by the authors.
Exactly. The goal is to get you the information quickly but thoroughly without feeling, totally swamped by just how much they throw at you. And we need to be crystal clear. We're just conveying the ideas in this original book. We are absolutely not endorsing these viewpoints, just exploring the very provocative story it tells.
And what really grabs you about this book is how it starts. Right off the bat, it invites you to look behind these veils of misdirection, as they call it. It promises to show you the most dangerous enemy of all. So it's framing itself not just as history, but as uncovering a hidden truth, challenging how we normally think about history, about crime. It wants you to question the official story.
Definitely sets a tone.
Oh, yeah. And they don't hold back on the scope either. They preview this narrative that supposedly connects the dots from, the 19th century Opium Wars.
Way back then.
All the way through modern organized crime, big political assassinations, even, and this is super controversial, the actual roots of the 1960s counterculture.
Wow, that's a huge canvas.
Incredibly ambitious. And, quite pointedly, they dedicate the book to unsung U.S. intelligence and law enforcement officers. People, they claim, who died or suffered an undeserved imprisonment in this silent war. That dedication itself just signals the immense scale and the deadly seriousness of the conspiracy they claim to expose.
Okay, so let's really get into that core idea. Dope, Inc. kicks off with this really stark, almost, chilling statement. America is at war.
Right, sets the stakes immediately.
But not a typical war, right? Not fought overseas. This is, as they put it, a battle happening on American streets, in schools, with, get this, casualties incomparably higher than at any other time since 1865.
Higher than the Civil War.
That's what they're implying. It's a massive claim. And the main weapon in this supposed hidden war, according to Dope, Inc., it's simply dope.
Drugs as the weapon.
Exactly. And here's the twist. Unlike most wars that bankrupt nations, this war, the book says, actually enriches the attacker while bleeding the victim dry. They put the numbers, at the time of writing, at $50 billion in U.S. retail drug sales alone.
$50 billion back in the late 70s.
Yep, and $200 billion worldwide. This huge pile of cash, they say, acts as a slush fund for everything evil in the world, including political terrorism and including the murder of American presidents. That's a direct quote. It's a massive claim about money, power, and violence all tied to drugs.
And they are incredibly direct about who they blame. The book points the finger squarely at the aristocratic and banking oligarchy of Great Britain.
The same elite, they argue.
The very same people the book claims that the American Revolution was fought against. It's a historical echo deliberately invoked. And when you look at the numbers they use, the body count, it's shocking.
What figures did they give?
Well, they state that over 48 million Americans, mostly young people, 12 to 25, were officially known by the Drug Enforcement Administration back then as frequent users of heroin, cocaine, marijuana.
48 million.
And from that, the authors draw this conclusion that over a quarter of the entire American population is essentially severely wounded or dead in a war that, most people aren't even aware is happening.
That's a terrifying perspective.
It is. And what makes it even more unsettling from the book's viewpoint is that this isn't just some accident, or criminals just being opportunistic.
Right.
No, they allege it's all described by the authors as the coordinator for introducing psychedelics to American youth in the 60s. So the book is suggesting this really deep, long-game strategy aimed at weakening American society from the inside out, not just about making money off addiction.
So if this is such a massive secret war, how does it stay hidden? How do they manage an operation that huge?
The book's answer is basically camouflage. It argues that the colossal amounts of drug money, they mention, for example, the Hong Kong and Shanghai bank laundering maybe $10 billion a year, it's all just disguised as normal free enterprise.
Just hidden in plain sight within the financial system.
Exactly. To make the point, they talk about powerful groups like the Bronfman family in Canada, the liquor giants.
Seagrams, right.
Yeah, Seagrams, and the Jacobs family in Buffalo, big in sports concessions and things. The book claims these legitimate-seeming businesses actually finance organized crime, all under the cover of, free enterprise business relationships. They're arguing the line between legitimate business and organized crime is intentionally blurred at the very top.
So they're not just pointing fingers, they're claiming to map it all out.
They promise to uncover these conspiracies, which they describe as this intricate spider's web of the British monarchy. And this web, they claim, connects all these groups you might think are separate.
Like who?
Like Italian surname organized crime syndicates, London's Zionist-covered terrorist operation, even the secrets of Peking's dope-running foreign intelligence organization.
Oh.
All tracing back, they claim, to a common source, a common mother, the great aristocratic families of Britain. That's the absolute core of their thesis. Seemingly separate criminal outfits are actually part of one unified, top-down structure run by the British elite. It completely challenges the idea of independent mafias or cartels.
Okay, so to really grasp this alleged dope empire, the book says we need to go way back to the 19th century, specifically to Britain's Opium Wars with China.
Right, the historical foundation.
The book claims British finance was absolutely central, protecting and expanding the global drug trade through this tight network of powerful families and institutions. They name names: Matheson, Keswick, Swire, Dent, Baring, Rothschild.
Big names in finance and trade history.
Huge names. And the banks, too. Jardine Matheson, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, Chartered Bank, even the Peninsular and Orient Steam Navigation Company, the shipping line, P&O.
So not just fringe elements, but core institutions of the British Empire, allegedly.
That's the claim. These weren't just disconnected players. They were supposedly working together, building and maintaining this global drug trade. The book then zooms in on that famous confrontation in Canton. You have the Chinese commissioner, Lin Zexu, trying desperately to stop the opium flooding his country.
A national health crisis, basically.
Exactly. So Lin moves to arrest British nationals involved in the smuggling. But then the British Crown Commissioner, Captain Charles Elliot, supposedly steps in, using the Royal Navy to protect the smugglers.
Protecting the drug dealers, essentially.
That's how the book frames it. And when Lin besieged the foreign factories, demanding the opium be handed over, Elliot apparently told the British traders, "Don't worry, hand it over, the Crown will pay you back for your losses."
Setting them up for a government bailout for their illegal goods.
Precisely, and the book argues this wasn't just about protecting merchants, it was a calculated move. Elliot's actions, they claim, were a deliberate snare.
A trap.
Yeah, designed to provoke China, to give Britain an excuse, a casus belli, to declare war. They even quote Matheson from Jardine Matheson, supposedly writing gleefully to his partner Jardine, saying, "The Chinese have fallen into the snare."
Wow, that's quite damning, if true.
It is. And this, the book claims, gave Palmerston, the prime minister, the green light to send in the troops, starting the First Opium War. And the outcome was predictable, according to the book. The Chinese forces, supposedly weakened by years of addiction spreading through the army, were just no match for the British military.
So the addiction itself was a weapon, in a way.
That's strongly implied. Now, what's really crucial to the book's argument is what happened after the war. Elliot sends back a draft peace treaty, the Treaty of Twempi, in 1841.
Okay.
But Palmerston allegedly rejects it completely, his demand. That opium must be admitted into China as a legal item of trade.
Legalizing the drug trade by force.
Essentially, yes, using Britain's naval power as the hammer. The stated reason, according to Palmerston, was to open new vents for our industry, which the book flatly interprets as meaning opium because other European manufacturers were starting to compete in other markets. This really hammers home the book's core point. Opium wasn't just some side hustle. It was allegedly a strategic pillar of British economic and foreign policy.
Okay, so that's the first Opium War. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Not at all. The book argues this dope empire just continued to expand with the Second Opium War. It claims Lord Palmerston, who they specifically identify as the High Priest of the Scottish Rites, connecting him to those secret societies again.
Right, that recurring theme.
He returns as Prime Minister in 1859, supposedly with the express purpose of launching this second war to fully achieve that open China policy he'd outlined years before.
What was the trigger this time?
The book says it was a really flimsy excuse. A joint British-French force got beaten back at the Taku forts in 1859. That defeat, they claim, was used as the pretext for a full-scale joint siege of Peking, modern Beijing, in October 1860.
And how did that go?
According to the book, the city fell in just one day, almost no resistance, again implying internal weakness due to the ongoing drug problem.
And then comes the aftermath, which the book paints in very dark colors.
Extremely dark. Despite French objections, the British commander, Lord Elgin, son of the Elgin Marbles guy, allegedly ordered the temples and sacred shrines in Peking to be sacked and burned.
Deliberate cultural destruction.
The book calls it a show of Britain's absolute contempt for the Chinese, just pure power play. And the economic results were immediate. Within 4 years of the treaty ending that war, Britain controlled something like 7/8 of China's hugely expanded foreign trade.
And the opium?
Skyrocketing. Opium exports from British India jumped from about 58,000 chests in 1860 to over 105,000 chests by 1880. Just an explosion.
That's staggering growth. And the book connects this to other events.
Yes. Crucially, it argues that after Britain took heavy financial hits during the U.S. Civil War, supporting the Confederacy cost them, the oligarchy supposedly doubled down on the opium trade to make up the losses.
Turning to drugs to balance the books, essentially.
That's the claim. And to handle this massive increase in drug money, the book says the British banking circle set up the Hong Kong and Shanghai Corporation Hong Shang in 1864, specifically as the main bank for the opium trade.
An institution built on drug money, allegedly.
And almost at the same time, the Matheson family, who were in it from the start, founded Rio Tinto. Yeah, the huge mining company we know today as Rio Tinto Zinc.
Rio Tinto.
Wow.
Their initial purpose, according to the book, shipping ores as a way to pay for the opium. It paints this picture of a highly organized, almost industrial-scale drug operation, deeply embedded within major British financial and industrial institutions. Okay, so this structure is supposedly in place by the mid-19th century. Does the book claim it continued openly into the 20th century?
It absolutely does. Even after World War I and the creation of the League of Nations, which was supposed to, promote international cooperation and crack down on things like the drug trade.
Right, that was part of its mandate.
The book claims Britain just flaunted its drug trafficking before the world community. It even mentions that the American news magazine The Nation, which was generally pro-British, supposedly ran articles critical of Britain's role in the drug trade during this time. So it wasn't exactly a total secret, even if it wasn't front-page news.
Interesting. So how did Britain handle this scrutiny within the League of Nations itself?
Well, the book describes this really remarkable incident at the 5th session of the League's Opium Committee. British delegates were apparently confronted with huge differences between their official opium shipment figures to Japan and the figures reported by the Japanese government.
A discrepancy.
A massive one. Britain claimed they were shipping negligible amounts, but the Japanese figures showed a huge, thriving British opium trade flowing into their country. When this was pointed out as clear evidence of large-scale smuggling, what was the British delegates' response, according to the book?
What did they say?
They apparently argued that all this black market smuggling just proved the need for Britain to establish a government-owned opium monopoly.
Wow. Their solution to illegal drug trade was government-run drug trade.
That's the argument presented in the book. Just an astonishing level of, well, audacity, if true. And the book backs this up with economic data.
Oh, yeah.
It claims that as late as 1927, official British government statistics, and this is excluding the black market, showed that opium revenues made up huge chunks of the total income for major British colonies in the Far East.
Like how much?
For the Straits Settlements, which is modern Singapore and parts of Malaysia, it was allegedly 37% of total revenue. For British North Borneo, 23%. That's not small change. That's fundamental to the colonial economy.
So opium wasn't just tolerated. It was a pillar of colonial finance, according to this account.
That's the picture painted. The book even claims that when Mahatma Gandhi started campaigning against opium addiction in India in 1921, his followers were arrested not for rioting or anything, but specifically for undermining the revenue.
Undermining the government's drug profits.
Precisely. And they point to the 1923 Lord Inchcape Commission report. Inchcape himself identified as a descendant of the founder of the P&O shipping line and a co-founder of Hong Sheng.
Deeply connected.
Right. His commission, while paying lip service to maybe reducing production if prices fell, explicitly warned against shrinking the opium cultivation areas because they had to safeguard this most important source of revenue. It's presented as cold, hard economic calculation trumping any moral concerns.
Meanwhile, what was the U.S. doing about all this, according to the book?
Well, the book notes there were attempts to push back. In 1923, Representative Stephen Porter, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, managed to get a bill through Congress.
What did it do?
It called for setting country-by-country quotas for opium importation, aiming to slash consumption down to about 10% of the levels at the time, basically, just enough for legitimate medical needs. So you see this tension, the U.S. trying to curb the flow, while the book claims the British Empire was deeply invested in keeping it going.
Okay, this is where the book takes an even sharper, more controversial turn, isn't it? Connecting this drug trade to political assassinations in secret society.
Exactly, the alleged Assassination Bureau. The book claims that this narcotics trafficking wasn't just running alongside organized crime, it was fundamentally intertwined with it, both in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it brings back Prime Minister Palmerston again.
The high priest of the Scottish Rites.
Right. The book alleges he was leading this double life, conducting the opium business behind a screen of respectability while secretly being neck-deep in this vast criminal enterprise. And then, the really explosive claim...
The Lincoln assassination.
Yeah. Dope Inc. directly links Abraham Lincoln's assassination to Palmerston's secret life. It even suggests that American counterintelligence figures of the time, like Edgar Allan Poe and Samuel Morse, who wrote articles as Brutus warning about British aristocratic plots, they supposedly knew about this threat. It implies this hidden conflict was understood at certain levels.
That's an incredible reinterpretation of those historical figures. And how does the book claim these operations were structured? Through secret societies.
Precisely. The book claims the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry modeled its own covert operations on what it calls ethnic secret societies. It specifically describes something called the Order of Zion.
Okay, what's that, according to the book?
It's described as a highly specialized dirty tricks operation, supposedly founded by London-based families the book terms Hofjuden, or court Jews. It names families like the Makadas, Goldsmiths, Montefiores, de Hirsch.
And the book is careful here, right?
Very careful to state this isn't about Jewish people in general. It portrays these specific families as loyal agents of the British monarchy, orchestrating this Zionist network for British intelligence. It even calls them persecutors and tormentors who ran an extortion racket against the Jewish people. That framing is absolutely central to their controversial argument about these cutouts.
Okay, and then it connects this to other organizations.
Yes. Very controversially. It claims that in 1843, B'nai B'rith was founded essentially as a branch of the Scottish Rite for American Jews. Its first headquarters, the home of Joseph Seligman, a merchant tied to the British cotton oligarchy.
And the connection to the Confederacy.
This is even more explosive. The book states B'nai B'rith merged its operations with another Scottish Rite branch, the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Which they call the forerunner to the KKK.
Exactly, and the training ground for Confederate leaders. The book then names Judah P. Benjamin, a British subject, B'nai B'rith leader and Confederate Secretary of War and State, and Dr. Cutner Baruch, another B'nai B'rith leader and Bernard Baruch's grandfather. It alleges these two co-founded the KKK, along with Confederate General Albert Pike, a top Scottish Rite figure, and, bizarrely, a Jesuit priest.
That's quite a coalition.
An extremely unlikely one, you'd have to say. But this group, the book claims, is who carried out the Lincoln assassination. They even assert that key documents proving this are still locked away in Defense Department archives.
So diving deeper into the Lincoln plot specifics.
The book claims the Order of Zion and Palmerston's Scottish Rite were essentially two sides of the same coin, pointing out that the same man, Adolphe Isaac Cremieux, led both groups in France, suggests unified command,
Okay.
and the actual order for Lincoln's assassination, allegedly given by Judah P. Benjamin. The book cites a report from the judge advocate investigating the assassination for the military commission as its main source for this.
And the funding.
Confederate secret intelligence supposedly raised nearly $650,000, a massive sum, then through bond sales in Liverpool, creating a slush fund for dirty tricks. Their HQ, the secret cabinet, was in Montreal's St. Lawrence Hall. And here's the kicker. That's the exact same building as the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in Canada, General Sir Fenwick Williams.
That proximity is presented as pretty damning evidence.
Very much so. The book then claims Jacob Thompson, head of the secret cabinet, withdrew $180,000 from the Bank of Montreal just 8 days before Lincoln died to get the plot rolling. The Courier. John Harrison Surratt, described as a British agent trained at Jesuit Georgetown College.
And what happened to the alleged ringleaders, Thompson and Benjamin?
Never caught, according to the book. Both supposedly fled to England and lived under Crown protection. The book also claims key documents are still locked up, and Jefferson Davis's papers, supposedly held by the Bank of Montreal, have never been acknowledged by the bank.
So the conclusion drawn is
that American military intelligence back then traced Lincoln's death directly to British-controlled and British-funded networks. And then the book makes that incredible leap, drawing a direct line to the JFK assassination. It suggests Jim Garrison's investigation pointed to the exact same operation, just substitute Permindex for secret cabinet and Major Louis Bloomfield for Judah Benjamin.
a continuous pattern of assassination orchestrated from the same source across a century. That's the core argument.
Exactly. A truly staggering claim of long-term covert warfare. And the book loops this back to economics, connecting the dope trade directly to Southern cotton.
How do they make that connection?
They argue that, for all purposes, it was the dope trade. Opium, they claim, was the essential final stage in the demand cycle for British-financed and slave-produced cotton.
Explain that cycle.
British firms bring slave-grown cotton to Liverpool, turn it into cloth, then export that cloth to India, destroying India's own textile industry in the process. India then has to pay for this imported British cloth. How? With the money earned from exporting Bengali opium to China.
So the Opium Sales Fund, the purchase of British textiles made from slave cotton, a closed loop.
A completely closed and incredibly profitable loop, according to the book. And their assertion is that without the final demand of Chinese opium sales, the entire world structure of British trade would have collapsed. That's why Palmerston's focus on forcing opium on China was a hard contingency, absolutely essential for the empire's survival as they saw it.
And this structure evolved over time.
Yes. By the turn of the century, the book claims British subversion in the U.S. involved manipulating controlled elements of Italian and Chinese immigration, combining them with that Order of Zion entity we discussed earlier. These all supposedly merged together into what just became known as organized crime. It's framed as the strategic manipulation of migration and existing social groups.
And the Bronfman family fits into this narrative.
They're presented as a key example. The book claims Yechiel Bronfman's emigration from Romania in 1889 was actually sponsored by the De Hirsch Family Fund, a fund linked to bankrolling Zionist organizations. This is used to suggest a direct strategic link to that alleged Order of Zion network from the very beginning of the family's story in North America.
Okay, and the Order of Zion itself, the book connects it to other groups.
Yes, another highly controversial claim. It describes the Order of Zion as simply the Jewish division of the most venerable Order of St. John of Jerusalem.
The Knights of St. John.
Yes, that London-based chivalric order and secret society whose members supposedly swear blood oaths. And then comes perhaps the most startling claim about this order.
The protocols?
The infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The book asserts these weren't an anti-Semitic forgery, as is widely accepted historically. Instead, it claims they were the actual minutes of the order from a meeting in Paris in 1884.
And how did they get out?
Allegedly intercepted and published by Russian counterintelligence, the Okhrana, as revenge for the order's supposed role in destabilizing Russia around 1905. Again, it's vital to stress this contradicts the historical consensus, but is what the book itself claims.
And there's that oath mentioned.
Yes, a truly chilling quote attributed to the Mexican Knights of Columbus. The book emphasizes it's not the U.S. group. This alleged oath includes vows to wage war on heretics, Protestants, Masons, to hang, burn, strangle, and bury alive those infamous heretics, even horrific violence against women and children. While the book says sources in Mexico confirmed its authenticity, it offers no independent proof. It's used, within their narrative, to illustrate the alleged violent, occult nature of these interconnected secret societies, all ultimately tied back, they claim, to the British oligarchy.
Right, okay, so moving into the 20th century, specifically the period around 1919-1920, the book highlights two events as being absolutely pivotal.
Yeah, critical strategic importance, they call it. First, the founding of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the RIIA. We'll come back to them.
Chatham House, yeah.
And second, what the book calls Britain's declaration of its Opium War against the U.S., but in a form Americans knew differently. Prohibition.
They're framing Prohibition itself as an act of war by Britain.
Directly. The book argues Prohibition deliberately brought narcotics traffickers, and large-scale organized crime into the United States. It says illegal booze and illegal drugs weren't separate issues. They were just two different product lines of the same multinational firm.
And the supplier was?
Britain, allegedly. Through their distilleries in Scotland and Canada for the alcohol, and their opium refineries in Shanghai and Hong Kong for the drugs. Their banks in Canada and the Caribbean provided the financing, and political allies in the U.S. supposedly created the conditions, the demand, allowing Britain to try and, quote, win back the U.S. through subversion, rather than the direct conflict that failed in the Civil War. Prohibition is a kind of Trojan horse.
That's a radical reinterpretation of Prohibition. Do they offer any evidence for this link between alcohol and narcotics trafficking then?
They do mention that Drug Enforcement Administration officials at the time reportedly noted how similar the methods were, the modus operandi for smuggling both booze and drugs. They specifically point out that guys working for Arnold Rothstein and Meyer Lansky could apparently just legally buy heroin from British sources in the 1920s.
Legally buy heroin?
From the British side, yeah, which suggests a direct, open supply line feeding right into the heart of American organized crime during Prohibition.
Okay, but what about the temperance movement itself? Wasn't that a genuine social movement?
Not according to Dope, Inc. The book calls it a fraud of the highest order. It argues groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League weren't mass protests at all. They were supposedly small, well-financed, and highly organized circles, secretly backed by some of the wealthiest families in America, the Astors, Vanderbilts, Warburgs, Rockefellers.
So elite funding behind the scenes, manipulating public opinion.
That's the allegation. The money supposedly flowed mainly through tax-exempt foundations like the Russell Sage Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. The book even claims John D. Rockefeller Sr. was tricked by Mackenzie King, who'd later become Canada's PM, and was linked to Lord Beaverbrook into funding the WCTU and even giving them his foundation's private investigators.
Wow, so it wasn't just grassroots pressure.
The book paints it as a carefully managed campaign. It claims a whole coalition of British-linked cults pushed for Prohibition, the WCTU, the Anti-Saloon League, the KKK, and even something they call the British intelligence-organized Baha'i terrorist cult based near Chicago.
The Baha'i. That seems unlikely.
It's definitely one of the book's more unusual claims. They also point to Fabian social workers like Jane Addams at Hull House, arguing they used the combination of women getting the vote and men being focused on the war effort to ram through the 18th Amendment. So not a popular uprising, but a calculated social engineering project to disrupt America and, crucially, create huge new black markets for Britain to control.
And the book claims this wasn't just about supplying criminals from afar, that American elites were involved too.
Directly involved, allegedly. The book says the British oligarchy didn't just deal with the gutter elements. It claims a slice of the Anglophile portion of America's upper crust eagerly joined the fun, getting in on the action.
Any examples?
Joseph Kennedy is Exhibit A, his big liquor contracts during Prohibition. They allegedly came straight from the Duke of Devonshire, a top British aristocrat, and later Kennedy's daughter married into that same Devonshire family, cementing the ties.
So a direct aristocratic connection for the Kennedys' bootlegging fortune.
That's the claim. Another example they highlight is Robert Maynard Hutchins. He was president of the University of Chicago for over 20 years, a major intellectual figure.
Right.
The book alleges he was so tight with the British aristocracy, he actually became a knight commander of Her Majesty's Most Venerable Order of St. John of Jerusalem, swore an oath of loyalty to the British monarch. This is presented as proof of direct allegiance at the top of American academia.
And they connect Hutchins to later activities.
Oh, yeah. Even into the 1960s, after he'd left Chicago, Hutchins was supposedly investigated for links to drug trafficking and black market deals. His think tank, the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, was apparently funded mainly by Bernie Kornfeld's iOS Investments Overseas Service.
Which the book calls a pyramid scheme and drug money laundering.
Exactly. And Hutchins was also president of the Albert Parvin Foundation, which Congress apparently flagged as a front for Las Vegas gambling interests. It paints this picture of high-level corruption hidden behind prestigious academic and philanthropic facades.
And the profits from all this, from Prohibition.
The book argues those massive profits didn't just disappear. They were plowed into building gambling casinos, pro sports stadiums, racetracks, all through the 30s and 40s. This, they claim, built the infrastructure, the financial and logistical networks for the huge boom in drug trafficking that started in the mid-50s. But only after, the book stresses, they had deliberately created a cultural climate ready for mass drug addiction.
A multi-stage plan spanning decades.
That's the chilling implication. Planned social decay, funded by crime, paving the way for even bigger crimes.
Okay, now for a claim that probably raised a lot of eyebrows even when the book came out, the Nixon connection.
Yeah, this is definitely out there. Dope Inc. argues President Nixon was effectively a casualty in this ongoing drug war against Britain.
A casualty? How?
They suggest that if Nixon hadn't launched a serious top-down effort to shut down drug trafficking, he probably wouldn't have been unceremoniously forced out of office by Henry Kissinger, Ted Kennedy, and their British masters.
So they're framing Watergate itself as a British-instigated coup to stop Nixon's war on drugs.
That's the explicit claim, a pretty radical reinterpretation of Watergate, to say the least.
And speaking of the Kennedys, the book has strong opinions on them, too.
Understatement of the year. It presents the entire Kennedy family as having been basically groomed by the British, flea-dipped, scrubbed, and polished is the phrase they use specifically to be the respectable public face of organized crime. It states, flat out, the Kennedy machine is organized crime and government. No mincing words there. Implying their rise wasn't accidental, but a strategic placement by the British oligarchy to manage criminal networks from inside the U.S. political system.
Do they offer specifics to back up such a huge claim?
They do point to things like Ted Kennedy's 1976 Senate campaign, allegedly taking money from a guy named Joseph Lindsay.
Who was he?
Identified in the book as a Massachusetts bootlegger connected to Meyer Lansky, the alleged top boss of organized crime, and Raymond Patriarca, the New England drug kingpin. Lindsay was also on the board of a company called International Airport Hotel Systems, which the book links to Resorts International, a name that pops up later in connection with offshore gambling and drug money.
Okay, so campaign finance links. What about Joe Kennedy, the father?
The book goes back to his bootlegging roots, his mother's drive for social status, his marriage into the powerful Fitzgerald family. Then it talks about his move into Hollywood. He's supposedly partnered with a British figure, Lord Inverforth, who, the book notes, later worked closely with Britain's wartime intelligence chief, William Stevenson Intrepid.
Okay.
Together, Kennedy and Inverforth allegedly formed RKO Studios, which the book claims established British financial and cultural domination of Hollywood. So, painting the Kennedys as deeply entwined with British networks right from the start of their ascent.
On his finances.
Kennedy supposedly parked his fortune with Lazard Brothers, the merchant bank, owned by Viscount Cowdray, who the book identifies as Winston Churchill's cousin, and Kennedy's legendary stock market success, getting out before the '29 crash while head of the SEC. The book attributes that directly to his London banking connections, implying insider info from the British side.
They also mentioned his political leanings, right? The Cliveden set.
Yes, very controversial. The book claims Kennedy deliberately attached himself to the pro-Nazi British aristocrats in Lady Astor's Cliveden set. This group supposedly included figures from Lazard Brothers, Lord Lothian, George Bernard Shaw, even the Sassoon family tied to the opium trade.
And this group dictated Britain's appeasement policy towards Hitler.
That's what the book alleges, and because of these ties, it claims President Roosevelt actually came to see Kennedy as a Nazi sympathizer.
Okay, shifting to the next generation. Robert Kennedy's time as Attorney General.
The book describes RFK's Justice Department as operating with a real cloak and dagger style, having unusual access to sensitive files like the McClellan committees and highly irregular dealings with the FBI. Key figures like Walter Sheridan, Henry Peterson worked closely with the Organized Crime Division. The implication is that RFK's DOJ might have been, wittingly or not, acting as an inside player serving the interests of this larger alleged criminal network.
And then comes the biggest claim about John Kennedy.
The alleged double cross. The book claims that in the spring and summer of 1963, just months before he was killed, JFK started making major policy shifts.
Like what?
Like pulling back the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, opening talks with the Soviets for détente, even sending a secret envoy to talk to Castro in Cuba.
Reversing course on several fronts?
Exactly. And the book's conclusion is blunt and chilling. The British had him killed. It even quotes a supposed warning sent to Joe Kennedy after the assassination, allegedly from the powerful British press Baron Lord Beaverbrook, saying, Kennedy tried to double-cross the syndicate and he got iced.
Iced. Wow. Presented as direct confirmation from a British insider.
That's how the book frames it, which leads directly into this whole section on Permindex.
Which the book calls
Nothing less than Britain's Assassination Bureau. It claims that when New Orleans DA Jim Garrison investigated the JFK assassination, his trail led straight to Permindex.
And what was Permindex?
A corporation based in Montreal, headed by Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who the book identifies as the Bronfman family's lawyer. Here's where high finance, organized crime, and political murder supposedly all come together.
And Garrison's prime suspect was connected to Permindex.
Clay Shaw, yeah, a director of Permindex. Garrison suspected him of being a front for mafia, drug running, and crime in the Caribbean. The book alleges Shaw financed and controlled Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans and acted as a safe house channel to get other assassins out of the country, specifically to Italy.
And they link Permindex to other figures and events.
Oh, yeah. Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans mob boss, described as a Permindex associate. The book connects him not just to the 1962 assassination of Italian oil executive Enrico Mattei, but also alleges involvement in the later kidnapping of Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro.
How?
Marcello's company, United Air Taxi Service, supposedly shared pilots with Permindex. One of those pilots was David Ferry, who was found dead just days after Garrison subpoenaed him.
Very suspicious timing.
Extremely. The book also implicates an Italian Jewish banker named George Mantello, also known as Mandel, a board member of a Permindex subsidiary called Centro Mondiale Commerciale, or CMC.
How is he linked?
Allegedly implicated in Moro's murder. Weapons found at his villa supposedly matched those used in the killings of Moro and Hans-Martin Schleyer in Germany, and his Swiss holding company was reportedly exposed as a channel for funds from the Israeli Histadrut Labor Federation into Permindex. It paints this incredibly complex picture of international networks, crime, finance, politics, intelligence, all intersecting through Permindex.
And the book alleges direct British intelligence involvement in setting all this up.
A truly stunning claim. It says Sir William Stevenson, intrepid, the legendary head of British Security Coordination, BSC, and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, during WWII.
Right, a major figure.
Stevenson himself supposedly arranged for Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, the Permindex head, to get a commission as an officer in the U.S. Army OSS. Why? To run clandestine operations under an American cover. And the reason given in the book. Because Winston Churchill considered the U.S. an enemy nation.
Running British spies under American cover against America itself.
That's the shocking allegation. The book describes SOE operations based out of Rockefeller Center in New York, disguised as an import-export firm with another secret base in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Bloomfield's specific unit, Division 5, allegedly operated using the bizarre cover of being a Christian missionary group, sending agents throughout the U.S. and Latin America.
An incredible level of deception, if true.
And secrecy.
Absolute secrecy. The book claims all SOE activities fell under Britain's Official Secrets Act. Releasing information was high treason, punishable by death. That's why the book suggests a lot of leaks about SOE actually came from French, Italian, or West German intelligence who weren't bound by British law.
And the connection to the mafia. The book claims the Stevenson-Bloomfield team routinely used mafia figures as intelligence agents for the OSS and FBI Division 5. The most famous example cited is Charles Lucky Luciano.
Luciano worked for Allied intelligence.
Allegedly rehabilitated under OSSOE sponsorship, then sent to Sicily to help with the Allied invasion. The book even claims Luciano was still working with Bloomfield as late as 1962, acting as a case officer for operations in Sicily. This suggests a direct, ongoing partnership between top intelligence agencies and major organized crime figures lasting long after the war.
So Permindex, in this narrative, becomes the pipeline.
Exactly. The main courier channel for all the dope Inc. money, shuttling hundreds of millions, maybe billions, into secret bank accounts in Switzerland, Geneva, Basel, Liechtenstein, the Caribbean, and Meyer Lansky, the alleged chairman of the Board of Crime, is pinpointed as the driving force behind moving into big-time narcotics, offshore banking, and the Caribbean casino boom. Permindex is the artery connecting it all.
And this is a global operation.
Absolutely global. They mention Lansky's courier, John Pullman, making trips constantly. Bogota, Vegas, Honolulu, where the syndicate wanted to legalize gambling. Hong Kong, casinos and drugs. Lebanon, Switzerland meeting Lansky, moving money. Shows the worldwide reach.
How did the money laundering work, according to the book?
Funds allegedly went into specific banks in Geneva, Basel, Liechtenstein, or the Caribbean, all linked to Bloomfield's trading company cover, often using P.O. box fronts like Astaldo Vaduz or Defamico Vaduz, Credit Suisse is mentioned, and the Bank of World Commerce in Nassau, Bahamas. The book claims that was Lansky's personal creation, set up just for laundering.
And the biggest bank involved.
Allegedly, the Banque de Crédit International, BCI, based in Basel, Switzerland, it went bankrupt in 1974. But before that, the book claims BCI was practically indistinguishable from IOS, Bernie Kornfeld's investors' overseas services.
The mutual fund thing.
Yeah, which pulled in over $2 billion from anonymous subscribers. The book strongly implies this was mostly Lansky's money. And IOS itself reportedly channeled the distribution of LSD, hashish, and marijuana, so a direct link between high finance, mutual funds, and the drug trade.
And the people running these banks.
The alleged founder of BCI was Tibor Rosenbaum. He was also head of Bank Leumi, Israel's largest commercial bank, and on Bank Leumi's board. Figures like Lord Bancroft from the Hofjuden-Samuel family, a lord-in-waiting to the Queen, director of Cunard Lines, a shipping company the book links to drug traffic. Bank Leumi's subsidiary, Union Bank, also apparently deals in over a third of the world's diamonds. It just shows these incredibly dense connections between banking, aristocracy, shipping, diamonds.
And the book ties this all back to Britain.
With a very direct, provocative statement. Israeli banking and the Israeli Mossad are cutouts like their Hofjuden sponsors of the British monarchy, which runs the whole show through its merchant banks and its Knights of St. John. That's their bottom line. Britain controls it all through these intermediaries.
And the Permindex board itself.
Described as including agents for powerful Italian black nobility families, the Savoy, the Pallavicino, who were allegedly linked to the Lebanese fascist movement, the Phalange, and James Jesus Angleton, the legendary CIA counterintelligence chief who ran the Israeli desk and the Vatican desk. He gets pulled into because he was allegedly the OSS station chief in Italy right when Luciano was supposedly active there for the OSS. It suggests this tangled web reached deep into Western intelligence agencies as well.
Okay, let's talk about the sheer scale of the money involved. The global financial infrastructure, as the book calls it.
Yeah, they claim to lay out this exhaustive grid showing British control over laundering hundreds of billions of dollars through offshore banking, gold, diamonds, the worst.
The whole shadow financial system.
And they point to this tight integration between British Far East operations, dirty money worldwide, and top-level British foreign policy, all supposedly centered in the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA.
That Anglo-Dutch offshore banking system is presented as the key, right? How else could $200 billion in illegal drug money move around without being stopped? The book basically says the system was designed for illegal money from the start.
And they point to something striking: heroin prices. For a whole decade, retail heroin prices in major U.S. cities were allegedly almost identical, totally uniform. Despite busts, seizures, disruptions, the price stayed stable.
Suggesting tight cartel control over supply and pricing.
Exactly. And they also highlight this huge gap between how much opium is known to be produced for the black market and how much addicts actually consume. The supply, they claim, is maybe 10 times the demand.
So where does the rest go?
Most heroin, the book claims, is never actually sold on the street. It's warehoused, stockpiled in huge quantities, partly as a buffer against disruption, partly to keep prices high by preventing oversupply. They mention a specific Thai police raid in '72 on a refinery that found a 3,000-kilogram stockpile that's a tenth of all Southeast Asian production at the time, just sitting there.
Wow. And they claim this is centrally managed.
Right down to the growers. Market research from American cities is supposedly sent back to the poppy fields, telling Mio tribesmen exactly what they are told to plant: direct top-down control.
And that story about the Thai government burning opium.
Yeah, another really strange one. When Nixon started pulling troops out of Vietnam, it supposedly created a glut, an oversupply in the heroin market. So the Thai government allegedly stepped in, sold 22 tons of opium to the United States, which then publicly burned it all, to restore equilibrium to the market, according to the book. They explicitly compare this to the Chinese emperor burning British opium back in 1839. Same tactic, different century, allegedly done to stabilize prices for the suppliers.
So heroin as this perfectly managed commodity.
An ideal commodity cartel, they call it. Price is more stable than crude oil. And the sheer value. $25 billion a year just for heroin, more for other drugs. That's bigger than most legal commodities.
How does it compare to, say, gold or diamonds?
Well, back then, annual world gold production outside the Soviets was under $7 billion. World diamond output, under $5 billion. Heroin, the book calculates, was worth 366 times its weight in gold.
366 times.
And that's just heroin. They cite a $40 billion retail value for the Colombian marijuana crop alone. The numbers are just mind-boggling. An underground economy dwarfing legitimate industries.
And offshore banking is the key to moving that money.
Absolutely crucial, according to the book. These offshore banks, unlike U.S. banks, keep zero reserves. They just borrow from other banks if they need cash. Makes them incredibly flexible for shady deals. American banks themselves had over $35 billion parked in Caribbean offshore centers back then, more than they had routed through London.
And this shift offshore had a trigger.
The book points to the Kennedy administration. Treasury officials Dillon and RIIA pushed through a law taxing loans made to foreigners unless those loans were made through offshore branches. Citibank's boss, Walter Wriston, supposedly called this a pure gift to London because it just funneled money into those offshore havens many British controlled.
And the total amount in these offshore centers.
By early 77, the main group of 10 offshore centers held nearly $100 billion in assets. Bahamas, $35 billion. Caymans, $12 billion. Panama, $7 billion. Singapore, $10 billion. Hong Kong, $8 billion. And the book insists that's just the tip of the iceberg, doesn't count thousands of smaller outfits or the expatriate Chinese banks.
London itself is big in euro dollars, though.
The biggest, $90 billion in assets. But operating under the encouragement of the Bank of England, the book claims, with very little oversight. However, the British elite supposedly prefer to wash the really dirty money through the Caribbean, Hong Kong, places like that, rather than directly in London. Plausible deniability, perhaps.
And Panama's different.
Yeah, singled out as basically the only major offshore center not under direct British control. American banks dominate there. It's where the Colombian drug money marijuana, cocaine, gets laundered. The book even mentions West German banking sources believing Britain wants to take over Panama's financial system, pointing to Hongsheng's bid to buy Marine Midland Bank, which handles transactions for Panama's central bank, suggests an ongoing turf war for control of these money pipelines.
Okay, let's focus on that Far East connection. Hong Kong.
The absolute nerve center, according to Dope Inc., the financial center for the Far East drug trade, and the control point for the Golden Triangle where most of the opium came from. The whole structure there, the book claims, is run by the old-line British banks and trading companies, Hongsheng, Jardine Matheson, Charterhouse Jeffett, the Swire Group, P&O shipping lines and their local partners, the overseas Chinese networks, all operating under the joint control of London and Peking.
Joint London-Peking control. That's a huge claim.
It is. And Hongsheng, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, is described as the linchpin, the semi-official central bank for the British Crown colony, but also the financial hydra, pulling together the production, transport, and distribution of all of Asia's opium, dominating half of Hong Kong's banking business, positioned as the ultimate nexus.
Do they name individuals involved in this Far East trade?
They mention figures like Chen Pichen, also known as Chin Sophanpanich. He was chairman of Bangkok Bank, a huge $5 billion institution. But the book claims he fled to Peking in the late 50s to avoid fraud charges, maintained close ties with the communist regime even after returning to Thailand, and had direct links to the triads, the powerful Chinese crime syndicates. Shows the alleged overlap between high finance and organized crime.
Made Peking's reliance on Hong Kong.
Financially crucial, the book argues. Citing public records, it says Peking got about $2.5 billion flowing through Hong Kong in 1978 alone from investments, remittances from overseas Chinese. This income supposedly covered 40% of all of Communist China's import costs. And where did Peking do its banking and foreign investments? Mostly through Hong Kong, largely via Hongsheng, the very bank the book identifies as the heart of the opium trade.
So a symbiotic financial relationship between Communist China and the alleged British-run drug network.
That's the deeply uncomfortable picture painted. The book goes further, making the incredibly controversial claim that the Chinese Communist Intelligence Service, CCIS, and the expatriate Chinese networks particularly the Chow Chow group, who allegedly handled the actual drug logistics, are effectively the same entity.
Wow.
Operating under London's financial control, running through Peking London joint ventures. This suggests an astonishing level of collaboration between supposed Cold War adversaries.
Do they cite any external sources for this?
They mention Richard Deacon, a British author who wrote The Chinese Secret Service. Deacon apparently admits Chinese intelligence agents run heroin traffic from Hong Kong to Europe, possibly cutting deals with the mafia. He also supposedly suggests China uses opium both as a subversive weapon against the West and to fund its own espionage, presented as corroboration from an insider's perspective.
And that scandal involving the MI6 chief.
Right. Sir John Rennie, head of British Foreign Intelligence MI6, his family, the Rennies, were old Scots traders connected to Jardine Matheson. His son, Charles Rennie, got arrested in London in 1973 for heroin trafficking.
Son of the spy chief, caught dealing heroin.
Exactly. The British press was apparently slapped with D notices, official censorship requests to hush it up. But the West German magazine Stern, outside British control, blew the story open, revealing Sir John Rennie's identity from Hong Kong. The book uses this as concrete proof of the direct links. Hong Kong opium firms, British intelligence at the highest level, and implicitly the CCIS connection.
And then there are those alleged quotes from Chow Enlai.
Truly chilling, if authentic. The book quotes him supposedly telling Egyptian President Nasser in 1965 about U.S. troops in Vietnam. Some of them are trying opium, and we are helping them. The effect this demoralization is going to have on the United States will be far greater than anyone realizes.
Directly stating they're using drugs as a weapon against U.S. soldiers.
That's the claim. The book also cites the Soviet paper Izvestia from 1978, which allegedly quoted a 1952 speech by Chow Enlai saying, "Opium is one of the most powerful sorts of weapons of the proletarian revolution. It is extremely important for us to export morphine and heroin in big quantities, use them to weaken the combat strength of the enemy and destroy the enemy without entering into war with him." These quotes are presented as smoking guns, proving a deliberate long-term Chinese strategy of drug warfare, allegedly in partnership with the British.
Okay, so if Hong Kong is the operational hub, where does the book claim the overall political control resides?
At the very top, according to Dope Inc., sits the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the RIIA, based at Chatham House in London.
The influential foreign policy think tank.
The book claims it's much more than that. It's the top level of political control for the entire global drug and dirty money operation. It explicitly calls the Far East drug trade a British-Chinese joint venture in which Britain is the senior partner, all orchestrated from London.
And Hong Sheng, the bank, fits into this RIA structure.
Described as a special operation of the top British banks within the oligarchy, specifically focused on the Far East drug trade and controlled by its London committee, and who sat on that committee. Figures like J.H. Keswick from the Jardine Matheson opium dynasty and J.K. Swire from another hereditary opium trading family. These same men, the book notes, were senior officials in Britain's Ministry of Economic Warfare during WWII.
So a direct line from wartime government, powerful families, banking, and the drug trade, all converging at the RIA.
That's the alleged structure. The book asserts the RIAA and its key people control every important dirty money operation on the surface of the globe. It also claims the RIAA directly controls its Canadian counterpart, the CIA, which funnels drugs and money through Canadian banks into the U.S. So, not just crime, but a highly sophisticated, globally coordinated political and financial machine.
And the RIA's origins. The book connects it to Cecil Rhodes.
Yes, back to Cecil Rhodes's will in the late 19th century. His vision, the book claims, was to create a secret society to rebuild the British Empire, absorb much of the developing world, and, crucially, recapture the United States.
Recapture the U.S. Wow.
Rhodes's inner circle Kipling, Lord Milner, the Milner's Kindergarten Group, formed the Round Table. And in 1919, the Round Table supposedly founded the RIAA as the central planning agency for this grand project, this one world empire. The book is unambiguous. The Royal Institute for International Affairs is the secret society, the command center.
And this mission was passed down.
Allegedly, yes. Milner passed the concept to his protégés, Lionel Curtis of the Round Table and Lord Robert Cecil. Both were at that key meeting at Versailles in May 1919 where the RIA was officially born, presented as a clear, deliberate handover of this imperial agenda.
And that alleged 1949 deal between Britain and Peking.
The book claims that alliance was explicitly aimed against the United States, that both the British and Chinese knew it and said so, and that U.S. diplomats were reporting back home that they'd been shafted by their supposed ally, Britain, highlights this alleged strategic betrayal at a key Cold War moment.
What about the Institute for Pacific Relations, the IPR?
Described as the RIA's American branch. Funded by big American foundations like Rockefeller and Carnegie, yes, but the book claims it functioned exclusively as a branch of the RIA in British policymaking, and astonishingly pushed a pro-Maoist line within the U.S. State Department, suggests a deep infiltration of American policy circles by British interests serving the RIA's agenda.
And they provide examples of RIA figures directly involved in the drug trade or related activities.
Oh, absolutely. They point to Lord Humphrey Trevelyan. He was British ambassador to China, then Egypt during the Suez Crisis, then the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a major diplomatic player.
Right.
He's cited as having set up the initial U.S. opening to China in the mid-50s. Later, he chaired the RIA Council, while supposedly still keeping an active hand in the opium business through the British Bank of the Middle East.
Wow. So top diplomat, head of RIIA, and involved in drug finance.
That's the allegation. The book then makes the provocative comment that direct experience in the drug trade is apparently a standard qualification for chairman of the Council of the RIIA.
Implying it's a prerequisite.
Yeah. They note Waldor Astor, RIIA chair during WWII, was a descendant of John Jacob Astor, the guy who allegedly first got into the drug trade with the British East India Company way back in 1816.
Yeah, okay.
Suggests this deep multi-generational dynastic involvement.
And the RIIA Council is filled with powerful figures.
The book lists numerous members, showing these dense interlocking directorates. Top figures from Britain's biggest banks, oil giants like BP and Shell, powerful merchant banks like Kleinwort Benson, Morgan Grenfell. It paints this picture of a very small, incredibly powerful, tightly knit elite running vast swaths of the global economy and politics, all allegedly through the RIIA structure.
Any specific family links highlighted?
Henry Neville Lindley Keswick from the Jardine-Matheson dynasty supposedly holds the traditional family seat on Hongshang's London Committee, a direct continuation of the opium legacy. His father, Sir William Johnston Keswick, directed BP and the Hudson Bay Company and allegedly personally ran the Shanghai heroin traffic during the 1930s. Stark claims of direct, hands-on involvement at the highest levels.
And the Canadian connections again.
Eagle Star Insurance, identified as a Bronfman front via Trizac, supposedly had directors like Sir Kenneth Strong and Sir Kenneth Keith alleged to be the number 1 and 2 figures in British intelligence after WWII, the Hudson's Bay Company, run by Far Eastern old-line drug traffickers and their closest London contact.
Even Canadian Pacific Railway.
Allegedly has 4 members of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem on its board, including the chairman of the Royal Bank of Canada, and a figure named John Gilmer, identified as a patron of Chinese communist fronts in Vancouver. And the chairman of Hongshang itself, M.G. Sandberg, was made a commander of St. John in 1960. It's presented as this pervasive network, tying British, Canadian, and Chinese elites together through these orders and institutions, all allegedly linked back to the drug trade and controlled by the British oligarchy via the RIIA.
Okay, so we've got the alleged command structure, the historical roots, the financial infrastructure. Now, how does the book claim this operation actually works on the ground, especially in the West? Through these cutouts.
Exactly. The book argues that the direct lines between the British oligarchy and street-level drug dealing are deliberately hidden behind these middlemen or cutouts. And in the Western world, the prime cutout for Dope Inc., according to the book, is what it controversially calls the Zionist lobby.
That term itself is hugely loaded. How do they define it?
They're very specific and very careful, or perhaps calculated in their language. This cutout, they claim, starts with this core group of Hofjuden, or court Jews. These are specific families, they say, who have served the British monarchy loyally for centuries, deeply tied to European nobility.
And they explicitly distinguish this group.
Yes, they emphasize this should not be confused with the Jewish people as a whole. They actually describe these Hofjuden families as persecutors and tormentors who ran a centuries-long protection extortion racket against the Jewish people, while simultaneously creating this Zionist network purely as a tool for British secret intelligence. It's a very specific and highly controversial framing of history and identity.
And they name specific families again.
Rothschilds, Warburgs, Oppenheimers, Schroders, controversially claiming they were leading financial backers of Adolf Hitler. They also mention the Sassoons, the Rothschilds of the East, who moved from India to the Caribbean after WWII, supposedly setting up the casino gambling and offshore banking industries there, linking that back to the illicit finance network.
And the Bronfman family is presented as a prime example of these cutouts.
A sterling example, the book says, of a family handpicked and raised out of the gutter to become some of the best paid crooks in the world. Very direct language.
Raised out of the gutter.
Yeah, they trace it back to Yechiel Bronfman emigrating from Romania in 1889, claiming his passage was paid by the Moses Montefiore Jewish Colonialization Committee, which was set up by Baron de Hirsch, Baron Alfred de Rothschild, and other figures the book labels Zionists. Suggests a deliberate selection and placement by these powerful alleged network operators.
And their prohibition activities are key to this narrative.
Absolutely central.
Yeah.
They just switched from importing whiskey to exporting it massively into the U.S. when Prohibition hit. The book points to that $1.5 million payment they made to the U.S. Treasury in 1936 as basically an admission that they supplied half the illegal liquor pouring into the U.S. during Prohibition.
Half. That's immense.
Immense. And the stuff they sold, the Seagram chicken cock whiskey, is described as pure poison, allegedly causing 34,000 American deaths in the 1920s alone.
And this gave them power over crime.
Life and death control, the book claims. Gang bosses who didn't cooperate allegedly got executed. They mentioned Dutch Schultz as a buyer. In the early days, the Bronfman brothers supposedly ran everything from the Canadian prairies straight into Chicago and other big U.S. markets. Harry Bronfman allegedly set up a dummy transport company, Trans-Canada Transport, fronting for the Canadian Pacific Railway, to run booze across the border. They even built an underground pipeline. Shows real sophistication.
And the British connection was formalized.
Yes, in 1926. The Bronfmans had been importing British whiskey from the powerful Distillery Company of London, DCL, which the book says was controlled by British nobility. DCL then agreed to a 50-50 partnership, forming Distillery Corporation Limited. DCL's man was president, Sam Bronfman was vice president. The book frames this as the British elite formally bringing the Bronfman operation into their fold, giving them backing and legitimacy.
And they connected to other major crime figures.
Arnold Rothstein, the alleged godfather, is mentioned. Big distribution networks like the Reinfeld Syndicate, run by Joseph Reinfeld and Abner Longies-Wilman, supposedly handled the Bronfman liquor in the U.S. It paints this picture of a nationwide machine under Bronfman control.
And this led to the consolidation of organized crime.
The book claims Torrio's push to cartelize crime led to that 1928 Cleveland meeting where the National Syndicate was really born. Then came the Castellammares War in New York, where Lucky Luciano, allegedly backed by Lansky and Torrio, wiped out the old guard in the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, 40-plus gangsters killed.
And Murder, Inc.
Formed right after, the book says, by Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, initially as the enforcement arm to protect Bronfman liquor shipments. By 1932, you have the National Commission, the Board of Directors for Organized Crime, set up in Atlantic City with Lansky as the key financial and enforcement wizard. The book argues this whole structure was needed because the old British opium families, Keswicks, Sassoons, Inchcapes, were already planning, back in the late 20s, to flood the U.S. with heroin from Shanghai, and they needed this organized muscle to handle distribution and enforcement. Sir William Johnston Keswick allegedly dictated policy from London.
So after Prohibition ends, how did the Bronfmans maintain their position, according to the book?
They were washed, is the term used. They carefully laundered into respectability, brought into the lower rungs of the Hofduden caste by the established families like Rothschilds, Montefiores, de Hirsches. Mr. Sam Bronfman became a big figure in Canadian Zionism.
Chairman of Relief Committee's colonization associations.
Exactly. Set up a refugee organization with Canadian Pacific, and then the ultimate seal of approval, according to the book. In 1969, Samuel Bronfman is made a Knight of Grace of the Most Venerable Order of St. John of Jerusalem by the Queen. His brothers Alan and Charles made Knights of Justice. And the book stresses these appointments are emphatically not ceremonial. They signify real integration and working allegiance to the British Crown's network.
And who ran the empire legally and financially?
Their law firm. Phillips, Bloomfield, Weinberg, and Goodman. Lazarus Phillips is highlighted Order of the British Empire recipient, Canadian Senator, Royal Bank of Canada director as the guy who handled their complex legal and financial maneuvers. And Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, the Permindex guy, is described as a key partner, deeply involved in Zionist activities. The book links to the network.
And the criminal ties continued.
Right into the next generation, the book claims. Mitchell Bronfman, Alan's son, is explicitly named by police reports cited in the book as a kingpin of organized crime in Montreal, his exploits widely known. Reinforces the idea that the respectable veneer hid ongoing criminal operations.
Okay, let's shift to the Jacobs family and Emprise. Another key cutout.
Yes, described as one of the biggest private family-owned corporations around, controlling over 450 companies, sports arenas, racetracks, food concessions, even pro teams like the Boston Bruins, their official profit of $350 million. The book calls it a fraud, quoting law enforcement sources estimating billions in dirty money flowing through Emprise.
Billions, and they had legal trouble.
Convicted alongside mobsters in 1972, the book states, but they allegedly just kept operating as money movers and bagmen for the syndicate. They supposedly loaned huge sums to criminals, including $2 million to the Bronfman-owned Montreal Expos baseball team, and brought mob boss Raymond Patriarca into partnership in Bally Manufacturing, the slot machine company, portrayed as essential financial facilitators for top-level organized crime.
And Emprise started around the same time as the Bronfmans bootlegging.
Appeared in 1916, yeah. Using food concessions as their cover, allegedly a very similar modus operandi to how Mitchell Bronfman later supposedly smuggled heroin, suggests a shared playbook.
And there was that congressional investigation.
Congressman Sam Steiger, 1970-72, he put really damning reports into the congressional record, which led to indictments and convictions for Emprise and Detroit mob figures. Sports Illustrated ran a huge expose, Jacob's Godfather of Sports, though Emprise sued them for $20 million, and they settled, which the book sees as evidence of Jacob's power.
But the investigation was shut down.
Senator Robert Dole publicly complained when the hearings were suddenly terminated. The book alleges this happened right after a private meeting between Jeremy Jacobs and Larry O'Brien, who was then the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And what happened next? O'Brien became president of the NBA, an organization where the book says the Jacobs family had heavy board representation, presented as a clear case of political influence shutting down an investigation.
And the aftermath for the investigator.
After Watergate distracted everyone, the focus on Emprise just vanished. Congressman Steiger lost his re-election bid. Later, he apparently apologized to Jeremy Jacobs and even asked the Attorney General to get Emprise a presidential pardon for their 1972 conviction. It was denied, but the turnaround is presented as chilling evidence of the syndicate's reach and power.
And the next generation of Jacobs also got washed.
Same process as the Bronfmans, allegedly, using their Bronfman connections to gain respectability. Jeremy Jacobs supposedly got his higher education at the Bronfman-controlled Toronto Jockey Club, which the book calls a dirty money-gathering outfit where elites, off-duty, and gangsters could amiably mix, doing deals and socializing.
And others were involved in that circle.
Murray Koffler, founder of Shoppers Drug Mart in Canada, a regular at the Toronto Club. Identified in the book as a retail outlet for Bronfman dope running, his drug stores were even indicted over an amphetamine factory. Yet, the book notes, Koffler allegedly attended Princess Anne's wedding and was close friends with her husband, Captain Mark Phillips, again bridging alleged crime and British royalty.
And Max Fisher.
CEO of Marathon Oil on the board of Freyhoff Trucking, named as a prime candidate for arrest, as the kingpin of the vast narcotics trade in the Midwest. His truck stops and oil barges suspected as drug transshipment points. The book wraps this section with a grim warning. The Jacobs, Bronfmans, Fishers stand behind crime, drugs, political corruption, and are pushing for legalization of gambling and drugs, preparing Dopey Inc. to become a legitimate Fortune 500 giant.
Right. Now, perhaps the wildest claim of all, the alleged British role in creating the 1960s counterculture. Not just exploiting it, but creating it.
Yeah, this section is really something else. It's not just about sociology, the book argues. The drug rot counterculture was a literal resurrection of the ISIS cult from ancient Egypt, even down to using the ISIS cross symbol, they claim.
An ancient Egyptian cult resurrected in the 60s.
That's the assertion. And this whole counterculture was supposedly the deliberate result of Britain's long Opium War against the United States, involving chemical and psychological warfare alongside the Vietnam War. The goal: to foster this bestial rock and drug cult to make people passive and controllable, just like ancient rulers supposedly used superstition, magic, and drugs to keep their populations down.
And they believed this was necessary before drugs could take hold.
Exactly. The RIIA supposedly realized they couldn't have a mass drug epidemic in the U.S. until America's fundamental belief in science and progress was first significantly undermined. A truly sinister objective.
Who were the key players in this alleged subversion?
Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, and his brother Julian. They were tutored, the book says, by H.G. Wells, who it identifies as the head of British foreign intelligence during WWI.
Wells, Huxley, Orwell.
Their famous dystopian novels, Brave New World, 1984, Wells's works. The book presents these not as warnings against totalitarianism, but as mass appeal blueprints for Britain's enlightened world order. And controversially, it claims only in the U.S. are they taught as attacks on fascism, implying deliberate misdirection.
And Aleister Crowley,
The occultist. He allegedly initiated Aldous Huxley into the ISIS Golden Dawn Temple occult group and introduced him to psychedelic drugs way back in 1929, planting the seeds early.
So Huxley comes to the U.S.
In 1937, works as a Hollywood scriptwriter for MGM, Warner Brothers, Disney. And while there, he supposedly sets up these nests of ISIS cults in places like Ojai, California. His friend Christopher Isherwood promotes Zen Buddhism. They allegedly recruit artists and intellectuals, laying the groundwork for the LSD culture that would explode later.
And LSD itself, where did that come from?
Developed in 1943 by Albert Hofmann at Sandoz, the Swiss drug company, which the book notes was owned by S.G. Warburg. They speculate British intelligence and the OSS were involved from the start, pointing out that Alan Dulles, who later ran the CIA's MKUltra mind control program, was the OSS chief in Switzerland right when Sandoz was doing the LSD research.
Coincidence or connection?
The book implies connection. Then, in 1953, Humphrey Osmond gives Huxley mescaline. Huxley writes, The Doors of Perception, which the book calls the first public manifesto of the psychedelic drug cult, basically launching the idea into the mainstream.
And Rand Corporation gets involved.
Allegedly ran a 4-year experiment starting in 1962 with LSD peyote marijuana. The book links this to Rand's known work on things like limited thermonuclear war, suggesting a generally destructive or destabilizing agenda.
Timothy Leary.
After getting kicked out of Harvard in '63, he's housed in this huge mansion in Millbrook, NY, rented by William Billy Mellon Hitchcock from the super-rich Mellon banking family. Leary's big book, The Psychedelic Experience, was based on the ancient cultist Tibetan Book of the Dead, again tying the drug culture to these esoteric, cultic roots.
And who spread the LSD?
Gregory Bateson, Huxley's collaborator, allegedly kept the project going at the Palo Alto VA hospital, giving LSD to patients, creating a core group of followers or initiates. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was supposedly his recruit. Kesey then forms the Merry Pranksters, who travel around giving out LSD, holding the acid tests, generating huge publicity.
And the Haight-Ashbury scene.
The famous Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. The book claims it was set up directly by Bateson. And look at the founders listed. Dr. David Smith, who advised NORML, the marijuana legalization group. Dr. Ernest Dernberg, an active-duty military guy possibly tied to MKUltra. Roger Smith, a street gang organizer who was also Charles Manson's parole officer controller. And Dr. Peter Bourne, who later became President Carter's drug czar.
That's quite a collection of founders.
A very strange mix. The book then argues the entire pop music hit parade is run on the same principles as the ancient Egyptian Isis priesthood, aiming to recruit youth into this Dionysiac counterculture, implying popular culture itself is a tool of manipulation.
And the Vietnam War's role in all this.
Absolutely crucial, according to the book. Without the war, and crucially, without the British Secret Intelligence Service's anti-war movement, this whole ISIS cult drug thing would have just been a fringe oddity. The war created the necessary moral despair among young Americans, making them vulnerable to drugs.
So the anti-war movement itself was manipulated.
That's the claim. Lord Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley co-founded the Peace Pledge Union back in '37, then both came to the U.S. during WWII. The book calls Russell's anti-war stance a patent fraud. Claims he opposed fighting Hitler because of his Cliveden-set ties, but then argued for a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviets in '47 when the U.S. had the bomb monopoly. His later Ban the Bomb movement, described as really an anti-technology movement aimed at stopping Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program.
So his peace activism was a facade.
A tool, the book argues. From the mid-50s, Russell's job was allegedly to build an international anti-war, anti-American movement, upgrading the Peace Pledge Union into the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation and its U.S. branch. The Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, supposedly founded by New York's elite R-crowd banks, with James Warburg as a founder. IPS then allegedly funded SDS, the main student anti-war group, and its radical offshoots.
And where did the drugs for the movement come from?
From the same organized crime infrastructure, the book asserts, that set up the China Opium Connection back in 1928. The same network Huxley supposedly connected with in Hollywood. They just redirected the supply onto college campuses and into the anti-war scene in the 60s and 70s.
And the money laundering continued through foundations.
Yes, another channel. Tax-exempt foundations to finance terrorism and environmentalism. Robert Hutchinson's Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, CSDI, is mentioned again, funded by iOS and the Parvin Foundation, linked to Lansky casinos. Iowa supposedly gave CSDI $3 to $4 million in 1967 alone, leading to the book's mantra, "Wherever there is Dope Inc., a pervasive strategic network."
Okay, finally, the book talks about the push for drug legalization, the drug lobby.
Right. It states that at the time of writing, there were two Zionist lobby-sponsored bills in Congress aimed at nationally legalizing marijuana, one by Javits and Cook, the other part of a larger bill by Ted Kennedy.
And who runs this lobby, according to the book?
Out front, the most venerable military and hospitaller order of St. John of Jerusalem again. The book makes this bizarre claim that back in the 11th century, they ran hospices as a death cult, giving people hallucinogens and poisons, acting as a dissemination point. A very dark, ancient lineage alleged here.
And modern hospice organizations are implicated.
Hospice Inc. in the U.S., allegedly financed by the Kaiser Foundation, on Kaiser's board. Kingman Brewster, U.S. Ambassador to Britain, member of the Order of St. John. Kaiser's involvement supposedly dates back to '58 when Leary did LSD tests at a Kaiser hospital. The Kennedy Institute for Bioethics at Georgetown is also named as financing hospice work, and Ted Kennedy himself, along with HW Secretary Joseph Califano, were key speakers at the 1978 National Hospice Organizing Meeting, suggests high-level political support.
The Ford Foundation, too.
Called the world's largest tax-exempt funder for Dionysian cults. Has Order of St. John members on its board, like John Loudon, Eugene Black. Its policy direction, the book claims, was set by Robert Hutchins, the alleged former Capone mob controller. Ford allegedly gives millions each year to the RIIA and is the principal funder of the drug lobby in the U.S. It created the Drug Abuse Council in '72 with a $1 million budget, which then advocated for marijuana decriminalization, more methadone clinics, and the British system of legal government-supplied heroin addiction, all framed as policies designed to expand the drug market.
And specific politicians are linked.
Senator Jacob Javits gets singled out, described as having deep ties to organized crime, acting as a listening post and conduit for the Lansky syndicate, allegedly tipped Lansky off about IRS moves. His links to Lansky and Robert Vesco, involved in Caribbean drug traffic, supposedly surfaced during a huge marijuana bust where the defendant's lawyer was James Lawson, head of NormalL, the pro-legalization group, and Javits sat on NormalL's advisory board.
And NormalL itself
financed, the book claims, through High Times magazine, which it slams for targeting kids with drug ads and porn, plus grants from the Playboy Foundation, and anonymous donations, allegedly often from drug dealers. It all paints this picture of a systematic, well-funded effort to normalize and legalize drugs, presented as the final phase of this long-term British conspiracy detailed in Dope Inc. So yeah, we just walked through the really complex and, let's be honest, incredibly provocative claims of Dope Inc. This book just completely reframes global history, finance, war, all through this very specific, very dark lens of the drug trade.
It really does. From the Opium Wars, Prohibition, those alleged presidential assassinations, even the counterculture the authors are arguing for this single, continuous, controlled operation run by this entity they call the British oligarchy. It forces you to question, well, everything you thought you knew.
Absolutely. And we've seen how the book tries to meticulously connect the dots, these alleged family dynasties, the secret societies, the huge financial empires, all supposedly pulling the strings behind major world events.
Right. It paints this picture of a family operation, as they put it, so deeply embedded in global power structures that it doesn't need secret handshakes or rituals anymore. It just operates as part of the system of influence, allegedly. The sheer scale of the coordination they describe it's breathtaking, really.
And just to reiterate, our goal here wasn't to say, yes, this is true, or no, this is false. It was to immerse ourselves in and help you understand the very specific, very challenging narrative that Dope Inc. put forward back in 1978.
Yeah, a narrative that radically challenges how we usually think about history, about power, about crime. It's definitely a potent reminder that there are vastly different ways to interpret events, even events we think are well understood. Sometimes those interpretations are way, way outside the mainstream.
For sure. And it leaves you with some pretty heavy questions to think about, doesn't it?
It really does. The book forces you to ask, what would it mean if an entire generation was targeted by what it calls a calculated form of political warfare? And if, as the authors claim, the web of lies now hangs in tatters, what does that imply about our responsibility to, critically look at the stories we're told about who holds power and how they use it? Definitely gives you a lot to chew on.
Well, we hope this deep dive has maybe offered a new lens, maybe equipped you with some different ways to approach information, question assumptions, and perhaps it's even sparked your own curiosity to dig deeper into some of these tangled historical threads.